Well, hey there, welcome back. So, apologies again for the disrupted last few weeks and really just the disrupted year. It's just 2025 is just proving to be just one of those years. So, anyway, I'll do my best to be consistent for the rest of the time, for the rest of this year. We'll see how we go. Anyway, that's just a bit of an explanation. So I want to start just a short series today, as we just sort of like an interim series before we get to the next book of the Bible that we're going to look at. And just want to look at a few verses, a few particularly problematic verses, I think, that we come across in our New Testaments, verses that can very easily and often are taken out of context. And when they are, have some pretty devastating or some pretty bad outcomes as a result of that. And so I just want to highlight a few of them and look at them just each episode of each week for the next few weeks, and just to see if we can just get a better sense of what's actually going on in these texts, and hopefully from that get maybe a better sense or a better application of those verses. It's not to be pastoral, it's not to tell you, what to do about these particular circumstances, only just to say that if these verses are informing the way that you're doing that at the very least be fully informed about what's actually going on in these verses, so as to at least use them as correctly as possible, as closely as they were intended to be used in the first place. Now, there are actually verses we've looked at in previous series, and so you might have heard me talk about these before if you've been listening to the show for a long time. So I just wanted to sort of draw them out and treat them on their own, and in some cases sort of look at them afresh. I've just, I'm continually doing more research, I'm continually teaching more and writing more, and so there's always new things that I'm unearthing about these passages. So hopefully I can bring some new insights to them as well from previous iterations of us chatting about them. And so I just want to sort of look at those and really, again, just from this point of view of what's actually going on with them and what is the most appropriate way to understand and apply them. So we'll do that for a few. And then this sort of came out of the previous series. If you remember, we talking through Philippians, we got to Philippians 4, and one verse in particular, it's one that we are most familiar with, that talks about that we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. And that's just one example that we'll look at of a verse that can very easily, at a black and white reading, be made to say really whatever we want it to say and really be applied in any way that we want it to be applied. And so I just want to, again, like all of these verses, just sort of look at it through a lens of what is actually going on, what is Paul really intending by this, and so therefore hopefully provide something of a more informed reading and application of that. So I thought for the first week, let's just dive into some of the more controversial stuff that you could possibly dive into. Pretty much just go headfirst into the worst of it. And I want to look at the issue of divorce. It's one that's obviously the Bible has a little bit to say about, Paul has a little bit to say about it. And it's one of those verses that is pretty clear on the surface, but when you apply it, can become very problematic. And so we'll read the verse and then we'll just sort of unpack it, hopefully just to unpack it certainly within its context, and let's just see what turns up as a result of that. So it's 1 Corinthians 7:10, and it says, "To the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband must not divorce his wife." All right, so that's pretty clear, isn't it? That's black and white, that a wife under no circumstances can leave her husband, and if she does, she must remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And just as a counterbalance, husbands can't divorce their wives either. It's black and white. It's right there. Take those two verses out, and there's your instruction for all times and all places on the issue of divorce, that it just simply can't happen. There's no grounds for divorce. It's just not possible for it to occur. That's problematic at the very least, because it gives no nuance, it gives no scope to any other context or any other circumstances that might actually warrant the separation of a marriage. And so, look, just to be clear, I'm not here to give pastoral advice, and I'm certainly not trying to discuss the entire complex issue of marriage and divorce and law and culture and all of that. It's just too big a topic. I'm certainly not skilled to handle that. What I just want to do is to perhaps just diffuse this particular verse, because this quite obviously is a verse that can be very easily weaponized and very easily just applied to any situation, even in really quite dangerous situations. You know, there are certainly have been times where a wife will come to a minister, come to a pastor and seeking advice, you know, and she's in a dangerous situation. She's in a marriage where she's been abused, where there's a danger to herself, to her children, and she'll come seeking advice, you know, with obviously wanting to leave the situation and be told based on a verse like this, you cannot leave your husband. You have to go back to him. You have to be reconciled back to this man who is, well, abusing you, who's beating you, who's putting you in danger. And so obviously that is a horrific outcome. It's horrific advice. It's illegal advice, actually. It's making that person complicit in domestic violence in a dangerous situation. But more than that, it's obviously sending this woman back into danger and potentially children as well. So that's the worst case scenario, but it certainly does happen. It has happened and will continue to happen because we just take this simple black and white reading of these two verses and say, well, the Bible clearly says, so therefore you can't leave your husband. You can't leave that particular circumstance. And in fact, I remember many, many years ago now when I was a student, we were at college and there was a pastoral class of some sort. And we're talking about the issue of marriage and divorce. And the way that the class was structured is that we had students presenting some of their own research on these different topics. And I can't remember if it was a debate, but I just remember there's one side of the discussion, one particular student was making the case that divorce is forbidden under all circumstances. The Bible clearly says that there is no circumstance under which divorce is permissible. And the whole argument was simply Scripture clearly says that you cannot get divorced, that a wife cannot leave her husband, and just quoting this verse. And that was the whole thing. It was Scripture is timeless, that, these are holy Scriptures, that we cannot question them, we cannot, go against what they clearly state. And so therefore, under no circumstances can divorce ever happen. Now, you can imagine that in a fairly large class of students, it erupted into more than a discussion, let's just say. It got very heated. And there was, questions and, challenges coming from every angle in the room of people, what about in this circumstance? What about in this circumstance? And legitimate circumstances, legitimate situations where it would be warranted to at least say, hey, get that person out of that dangerous situation. And the response was always, no, the Bible clearly says, the Bible clearly says. Now, I don't know if what happened to that student, whether he went into ministry or not. It was a pretty rough day for him. And he actually brought his wife in as well to be part of this presentation. And I don't know what her impression of the college was or if the other students were after that, but it got pretty messy. Anyway, it just highlighted the very black and white, very simplistic approach that can be taken to Scripture, taken to verses like this, and then especially in pastoral circumstances, just made to apply to all situations without any nuance, without any consideration of any context, just simply the Bible clearly says, and so therefore you must. Now, this is kind of a reading approach that a lot of people have to the entirety of Scripture, and for the most part, it's not going to get you in a lot of trouble. Like, it's not going to cause, and especially it can be great if it's, something like love your neighbor as yourself. Well, take that literally black and white and apply that. You're going to be a pretty decent person. So there's a lot that a simple black and white reading can be to a person's benefit. Just don't commit sin. Don't do, some of that stuff is quite obvious. But as a holistic approach to all of Scripture, it is obviously problematic. And in some cases, it actually is quite dangerous. It's quite harmful to the people, to yourself if you're applying it to yourself, but especially to other people if you're in a position of authority and certainly in a position of ministry to be giving this sort of advice. So let's have a look at this verse, and we'll do some others in the coming weeks. But let's, for today, just look at this particular one, and again, just put it back into its context, put it back into the situation that it was written to, and to see if we can get a more nuanced approach to it, just to see if there's maybe a little bit more to what Paul is saying about this situation that might give us a bit more flexibility in the way that we apply it. Okay, so the first thing we need to be taken into consideration is the Corinthians in general. Paul is writing specifically to the Corinthian church, who are a particular group of people in a particular time in a particular place that is of no relationship whatsoever to us today in any part of the world, in any context, wherever you might be listening to this. It is an entirely different situation that Paul is writing to. And when Paul is writing to the Corinthians, the only people that he has in mind are those Corinthians. It's those particular people who are behaving in certain ways at a particular time that he's needing to address. And for Paul, he has this overarching concern that if they continue to behave the particular way that they are, there probably won't be a church for much longer. They're doing things that are absolutely destroying the church. And so for Paul, he's in absolute damage control. This is not Paul thinking about, just some universal ideas for all times and all places. He's thinking about, how do I keep this church alive? How do I keep this church actually saved? That's his absolute priority in all of this. And there's something else that drives Paul in all of his writing. It's the idea that Jesus is coming back tomorrow. He has no concept that there'll be a year 2025, none whatsoever, that there'll be anything like the world that we live in today. As far as Paul was concerned, Jesus was coming back in his lifetime. His whole priority in everything that he does, everything that he says, is to get as many people as possible saved, to preach the gospel to the ends of the earth, so that when Jesus returns, the gospel will have gone to the ends of the earth. That is his whole priority. And he's not thinking about social reform. Paul is not thinking about, trying to overturn the system because, we need to create a better world for in the here and now. This idea of your best life now would be just anathema to Paul. It would just absolute anathema to Paul. Paul is only concerned about the imminent return of Christ and getting the message out to as many people as possible so that everyone gets a chance to hear the message. And so his sole immediate priority in the Corinthian church is that when Jesus does come back, there will be a Corinthian church to come back to, because at the rate they're going, there just simply won't be. And so Paul is dealing with an immediate situation and a very precise situation that's happening within this. And there are plenty of other issues that are going on, and we've talked about Corinthians. We'll continue to talk about it for as long as this show exists. But this one in particular, it comes in the context of a broader series of issues related to marriage and related to sexuality. And the Corinthians in all of the situations, in all of the things that they're doing, they've got a simple ethos to their behavior, which is that this is just what we've always done. This is just how it's always been. The Corinthians are just being like normal people in that Greco-Roman world. We've got this idea that the Corinthians were a particularly evil group of people, particularly sinful. And Corinth itself was this cesspool of all things wicked, and it was just, the Las Vegas on steroids of the immoral ancient world. It's just simply not true. Corinth was just a city like any other city, and the people in Corinth the Corinthian citizens were no different to anybody else in any other part of the world. They were just very, very normal people in what was a very, very immoral world, certainly by a Christian standard, an extraordinarily immoral, evil world. And within that, the Corinthians were just Corinthians. They were just doing what they had always done. Now, the other dimension that we always have to keep in mind is that when Paul writes to these churches, the churches that he's writing to are brand new churches. When we think about scripture and we think about reading our Bibles and the culture that we live in, we've got 2,000 years of Christian history behind us. Particularly if you live in the West, you've got a whole Judeo-Christian worldview that underpins the very foundation of what it means to be in the West. We just take for granted that Christianity, and we don't even really see it anymore. Christianity just permeates everything about our lives, and we don't even notice it anymore. It's just so deeply embedded in our very worldview. And so we take a lot of these things for granted. We just take for granted that there are certain moral standards that we should generally hold to. And even if you're not a Christian, you'll generally agree to them anyway, because it's just in the system. It's just in the way that we think and the way that we act. And so just in that alone, we have to, at least gives us a moment of caution when we read scriptures to remember they didn't have that benefit. The Corinthian church, when Paul was writing to them, was quite literally 5 years old. And prior to that, there was no such thing as Christianity in Corinth. It was a brand new thing. And so these Christians are adult Christians who've grown up with no idea of that there is such a thing called Jesus, that they've never heard of Christianity before because it's never existed before. So these are brand new, very first generation Christians who have grown up their whole life to this point, living in a certain way, thinking, and not just living in a certain way, but living in a way that, as for all intents and purposes, is the right way to live. This is the normal way to do things. And so whatever moral values and whatever standards they might hold are what the society holds and just simply what they have been doing their whole lives. And so we could still apply this in any context today where you've been brought up to believe a certain thing. From birth, you've been told this is how things are. This is what is good. This is what is bad. Do this, don't do that. And it's all you know. And then somebody comes along with a radically different idea, just a completely upside down way to look at the world and to look at all things related to every aspect of your life. And they were to say, right now, in this moment, you need to stop everything you've been doing since the day you were born and start doing the complete opposite and do it in a way that's completely natural, like you've been doing it your whole life. That's a difficult challenge. That is a challenge that Paul is facing in his churches, and he recognizes this challenge because this is what he's up against. This is what he's been facing from the minute that he started his ministry. And so the Corinthians are first and foremost just doing what they have always done. Now we need to add to this the fact that Paul's been gone for a few years. Paul planted the church for the 18 months that he was there. By the time he writes 1 Corinthians, about 3 years has passed. And he hasn't been around. He's been doing other things. He's been busy elsewhere. There have been teachers that have been left behind in Corinth, but they haven't been Paul. And so when Paul was there for the 18 months, he was dealing with a whole lot of different issues. There were lots of issues that were popping up that he would have been able to deal with, because they're going to come to Paul and they're going to say, all right, look, this is happening over here. We've always dealt with it this way. This is how we've always treated, or how we've always responded in this circumstance. And Paul would say, all right, well, this is what I would do from this Christian worldview. This is how I'd respond to that. And this is just as a sort of another dimension to that again. For Paul too, he doesn't have scripture to give him answers to most of these problems. Jewish scripture deals with Jewish problems. It's written for an ethnic group of people who were living in the desert, who've been brought into the land, and who were taught to live in a certain way based on a particular relationship with Yahweh and with the temple. That doesn't apply in the New Covenant, and it certainly doesn't apply in a Greco-Roman context like Corinth. Corinth is in every way unrelated to everything that is Jewish, and Greco-Roman problems are not issues that the Jewish scriptures face because they just don't have that as a part of their world. And more than that, those scriptures were written centuries before Paul even got to Corinth. And so much of what they said were becoming irrelevant even to the Jewish people, let alone to a Gentile world like what Paul is facing in Corinth. So he doesn't even have scripture to draw on. He can't just say, well, it black and white clearly says this is what you must do. It's like, all right, well, the principle of scripture is this. And so what that would look like in this context would be, well, act in this certain way. And so we actually see this going on in Corinthians 7. At various points, Paul will say, look, this is not a command from the Lord. This is just my advice. This is what I would do in these circumstances. He just gives literal pastoral advice because there's no clear scripture on what to do. What does an engaged couple do? Should they get married? Should they not get married if Jesus is coming back tomorrow? Well, there's no commandment for that. There's no Old Testament scripture for that. It's just simply, look, this is a brand new problem. My advice would be this, based on my best wisdom and best experience. Do whatever you're going to do, but this would be the best way to go forward with this. And so what all he can resort to at times is just good wisdom. This would make sense to do it this way, but I don't really have a command for you because there's no scripture for this. This is all brand new. We still face this today, 2025. We've got situations that we're facing like social media, for example. How do you deal with social media? Or how do you deal with movies or, secular music or whatever it might be? Things that Paul would never even have conceived of because there was just nothing like that in his time. So there's no scripture for that. And so many of the things that we're facing even today, we don't have scripture for. We have principles, we have best advice, we have tradition, we have customs, but we don't have a clear scripture to respond to that. And so a lot of what Paul has to do is to do theology on the run, do pastoral theology on the run, and not from the perspective of, well, this is how it's got to be for all times and all places right up into 2025, but simply this is what's going to keep you saved, keep you in the fold until Jesus returns, which could be tomorrow. Like he literally could be back tomorrow. So you need to just hang in there, and that thing could shipwreck you. So let's figure out kind of a Band-Aid solution, a fail-safe solution that is going to just hold you in place until such time as Jesus returns. That's the best that he can do in a lot of these circumstances. So much of what he's saying to the Corinthians is that this is either my best advice, or in this particular case, well, there's something that Jesus once said. Maybe we can incorporate a bit of that into the response, which is what he refers back to. But again, there's no clear scripture, because even Jewish marriage back in Moses' day was different to what you're dealing with in a Greco-Roman marriage. So even that has to be nuanced to the particular situation. So I say all that to say, Paul is dealing with Paul has challenges already just in his own response to this, and he's thinking about the best possible advice for this particular situation specifically that he's facing in Corinth. He's not thinking about us in 2025. Now, it doesn't mean that what Paul says can't apply to us, only to say that that's not what he has in mind. So that at least has to give us a moment of pause in how literally we apply this particular instruction that he gives. At least make us stop and go, okay, well, what did you mean by it, Paul, in the first place? And is there a principle that we can still derive from that we could apply to today with all of that nuance in mind? So with all of that said, what is the actual context? What is actually going on in this particular circumstance that Paul is dealing with? All right, so he's dealing with people in Corinth who are Gentile. As we'll see in a moment, these are Gentile Christians in Corinth who are married and presumably would have been married before they got saved. So that's a pretty important piece of context there. These people are brand new Christians, and we know that they're brand new because Christianity had only arrived there 5 years prior to that, and these are adults who are dealing with here, and so they would have been married before they'd become Christian. And so at some point in their marriage, these people have encountered or have come into the faith and have been shown, and not just shown, but told that they need to live in a way that is completely upside down to everything that they've previously been told how to live, and especially with regard to marriage. So in order to really get this, first of all, we need to really get a sense of what an ancient marriage actually looked like. What these particular people that Paul was speaking to, what kind of a marriage did they have? And what we notice is that, firstly, it's a completely different idea of marriage to what we would hold. Now, I'm talking about traditional marriage today, but particularly the sort of marriage that the Christian tradition will typically uphold. When we think about marriage in the church, we talk about, a marriage where two people have, come before a minister, come before God and shared their vows. And then there's also a legal component to it, which binds them together. In most cases, the wife will take the surname of her husband and they'll become a family. They'll sort of become sort of this one person, and to whatever degree will share bring all their resources together, and whatever they do from that day forward, they do together. Now, of course, I know that there are variations of this and different degrees of this. I understand all that, but just that the general idea of a marriage is the two people coming together, and it's a very formal affair. It's a legally bound affair. There's paperwork involved. There's government bureaucracy that's involved. There's all of those things that go along with the marriage, and it's quite a complex process and quite a very formal process that you enter into. Divorce, conversely, is the same. It's a very legally bound affair. It's there's I've never been divorced, but from what I can gather of it, there's a lot that is involved in that as well. If it's a legal process to get married, then it's a legal process to get unmarried. And so that process as well. And so there's a lot of separation, there's a lot of sort of disconnecting, and there's all that sort of stuff. It's a very complicated situation, very complicated affair that divorce would be. So that's true for us today, but that wasn't the case in the first century. And so the first mistake that we make is to go look back on whenever Paul speaks about husbands and wives and assume that they're in the same situation as what we would think about in a modern marriage. It's just simply not true. What marriage looks like in the Roman world is much more like what we would call a de facto relationship. Now, what that means is that a wife will come and be married to her husband. Now, she'll be typically in her teens. 13, 14, 15 years old is when she'll typically be married. And her father will marry her off, or if the father's not around, her brother will marry her off to somebody of their choice. She doesn't get a say in this. These marriages are always going to be arranged. And she'll effectively be given over to another man who is going to be at least in his 20s. Generally, he's going to be about 10 years older than her. And he will basically agree to take over the responsibility of looking after her. The thing about a woman in the Roman world is that she always has to be under a man's authority, under a man's legal authority. She can't sign contracts. She has no legal rights of her own. They all have to go through her male guardian. So she always has to have a male guardian. Now, typically that's going to be her father. If it's not, a father's not around, it'll be one of her brothers, but somebody has to be basically literally her guardian, her babysitter for the rest of her life. Now, when she gets married, in some circumstances, she will come under the legal guardianship of her husband. He will now become her protector and become the one who is literally the one who can sign contracts for her. But that's a pretty rare situation. What will typically happen is that she'll always remain under the guardianship of her father, or again, an older brother or male family member who is always responsible for her. She never actually leaves that authority. She always remains part of her father's or her previous family. What is really only happening is that she's moving into the house of a man who is her husband and who is given the responsibility of providing for her and protecting her and looking after her and making children with her. And her responsibility in return is to look after the house, to take care of the domestic affairs. Now, of course, everybody lives and works together. The family business runs out of the house. The house is the central unit of all life in the ancient world. And so her share in that role is to look after the house while he works, he provides, she takes care of the kids, she looks after the house. And so it's a team effort. They have to work together for the purposes of the business. And her primary role is to make children. Because only she can. She's the only one that can give birth to and nurse those children. So that becomes her primary responsibility. And in a world before contraception and a world before daycare, she's always getting pregnant and she's always having to raise the children herself because there's no one to give them to, right? Most women can't afford a nurse, and so they just have to take care of all the children themselves. And there's a great honor in that. So it's just a very old school traditional way of life and way of marriage. But the important point to remember is that when they get married, it's a very, very informal affair. It's quite literally two people consenting to be married, then they're married. In fact, she could just simply move in with him, or she could be a bit older and have a little bit more autonomy, like maybe not have a father around that's telling her what to do. She could enter into a relationship with a guy, and after a while they can say, look, I guess we're basically married. Yeah, I guess we are. And so at that point, at the minute they've both agreed that they're married, well, they're married. It's just as simple as that. They've now become husband and wife by their own consent, by their own decision. And so marriage itself is as formal as just, will you be my wife? Will you be my husband? Yep. Okay, great. We're married. And it's just a verbal assent to being married. And that's just how it is. And so really it is a de facto relationship. And to the extent that both parties in the marriage have their own separate stuff. Whatever she brings to the marriage, that's hers. And so if she comes from a wealthy family and has quite a large dowry, that remains hers. It doesn't get pulled in together with the family resources. That always remains hers. And so that the same way anything he has remains his. Now, the proviso to that is that if they have any children, the children belong to him because they were produced by him in his family, within his household. So those always remain his property. Anything produced in that household remains his because that is ultimately his house. But whatever she brings to it, that's hers. So it's a free marriage. It's literally just like a de facto situation. And so if marriage is as informal as, will you be my husband, will you be my wife, the same is true for divorce. at any point, either party could say, I don't want to be married to you, I'm out of here. Or the fathers could come along, or the father of either the husband or the wife could come along if they're still alive and say, no, I don't want you married to him or to her. You need to come and marry this other person, and then just annul the marriage on the spot. And so, wake up married, but you go to bed divorced. And it's just as simple as that. Divorce is as informal as the marriage itself. And so with that level of informality, you can imagine how, easy divorce is to come by, but how frequently it would happen. Now, to be sure, if you're a poor woman, like as in a low status, socioeconomically low status woman, you don't have a lot of options in this. Now, that's true for the husband as well. Most people are living just at the poverty line. And so they don't really have a lot of choice. They're really in it for survival. They've got to keep each other alive, and that becomes their priority. But certainly for her, she doesn't have the option just to get up and leave. He is her sole provider. Now, if she does leave, she'll go back to her father, but as often the case, he's not around or there's no brothers around to look after her. She's going to be by herself. And so she can't leave him. She can't just get up and walk away because she's got no other means of support. She can't work. She's never worked before because she's always had children. She's got no education because she's been married since she was 13. She doesn't actually have any options. And so the reality for most women is that they just can't simply get up and leave the marriage. It's just not possible. They don't have the economic resources to do that. However, for the women that did have independent wealth, their own economic resources, they could get up and leave, because they could look after themselves. They didn't need a husband to provide for them and to look after them. So they could very easily just up and leave and just go and marry somebody else and do it by the end of the day. Like, that was one of their prerogatives as a wealthier woman. And so, and the freedom for her to be able to do that meant that she could just simply do it. It was just one of the things that she could do, which means that divorce, at least amongst the elite, was very, very common. Now, you can see in wealthy Hollywood celebrities, marriage and divorce it's rampant through that sort of at that level of society. But it's very messy. Like it's just like all of the fallout that goes along with that. It was still the same case in the ancient world of just frequent marriages, remarriages, divorces, and all of that was commonplace. But it was just much easier. This was her stuff. She could just take her stuff, get up and leave, and away she went and go and marry somebody else. So it's only something that really takes place at that higher level. Now, of course, it's available and accessible to all people at every level, but the only ones who sort of had the economic resources to be able to actually make it work would have been the people at that high status level. Now, it's a different story when you look at the Jewish world. In the Jewish world, divorce was permitted under very, very strict circumstances, but the only person who could initiate the divorce was the man, was the husband. Now, again, in a Greco-Roman marriage, the Greek women, Roman women, they could initiate the divorce, no problems. They didn't necessarily have the resources to do it, but they had the legal option to be able to do that. It's a different story in the case of the Jewish marriage, where only the husband could initiate the divorce. She couldn't initiate the divorce, but he could only do it with a letter of divorce. He had to sort of formally announce to her that he was going to divorce her and state the reasons why. Now, again, coming back to the Greco-Roman marriage, reasons for divorce could be, they didn't even need a reason. Frankly, you didn't need a reason. But generally what it would come down to would be things like infertility. It would generally be the husband leaving the wife, and for reasons like infertility or infidelity, certainly not her leaving him for infidelity because he would be off sleeping with whoever he wants. It's really more of a case of she can't give him the honor, do the things that a wife is expected of in that world. And so those would be the reasons why. You wouldn't, for the sake of honor, a man wouldn't just up and leave his wife, because it would be somewhat of a dishonorable thing. He would want to, at least, if he's going to leave his wife, at least have honorable reasons to leave her. But not because he cares about her, purely because he cares about his own reputation. Different story in the Jewish world. It can only be for strict issues of immorality, and not just unfaithfulness in the marriage, but unfaithfulness to the law. If you stop being Jewish, if you stop, living in this Judaistic way of life, that's a reason to divorce. You've basically become unfaithful to God at that point, and so therefore that is perfectly good grounds to initiate a divorce. But it has to be for those reasons, and part of the reason for that. For the protection or for or the stricter guidelines for divorce was because it means that you're forced, particularly on the point of view of the husband, it forces them to stay committed to the marriage. Because if you just want to up and leave, you're going to leave your wife destitute. That's a terrible thing. That's an ungodly thing to do. And if you just want to leave her because you want to go and marry somebody else, or you just want to leave her for any particular reason that are selfish reasons, you're going to leave her destitute. That's you've failed in your obligation to your sister in the faith as well as your wife. So you can't do that. So it's a harder thing to come by, but very importantly, the wife cannot initiate that. And then so for whatever the reasons for that, it's just the way it was. So when we talk about wives leaving their husbands in a Corinthian church, we're not looking at a Jewish wife. We're obviously looking at a Greek or a Roman wife, because otherwise she wouldn't be able to initiate the marriage in the first place. All right, so that's something of the general cultural background. So then what's actually specifically happening in Corinth? Well, again, it's the Corinthians just being Corinthian. And there's one particular group, or there's maybe one or two of the men in the church who are still engaged in sexual immorality. And what I mean by that is that they are engaging with prostitutes. Now, why would they be engaging with prostitutes? Well, because that's what you do when you go out with your mates for a meal. So when you go over to somebody's house for dinner, very often what that will look like is a great feast and then a drinking party afterwards. And so you would have everybody would be getting outrageously drunk, and there would be a lot of sexual activity with prostitutes as a part of the entertainment. So it was just a Greek symposium that these men are participating in. You say, well, why would they possibly want to be part of that? Well, because that's just what everybody does. That's just how this world works. When you come together with your friends, you're doing it because you're establishing social networks, you're establishing business contacts, you're just basically keeping up appearances with your social group because they're mates. Like, these are people that probably had connections with going way back before they were Christians. And so they're trying to maintain those connections. And as a part of doing that, it requires going over to their house for meals or having feasts with these other people, which is involving getting drunk and sexual immorality. And so they're doing this and they're justifying it by saying, well, all things are permissible, or food for the body and the body for food, but all of God's going to destroy all of it. And just making these excuses, it's just sex. It's not a spiritual matter. It's just like eating food. I get hungry, I eat food. I want to have sex, I go and have sex. Like, it's all just a bodily function. And so it's actually of no moral consequence. Therefore, there's no harm in me doing this. Very typical view, very Platonic sort of view of the world and of the body. And so all of that, it's all just a very standard approach to that kind of behavior. And so what the Corinthian men are doing is that they're coming into the church and they're saying, well, that hasn't changed. We still think that way. That's just the way the world is. And so if we participate in those things, there's no harm involved. Now, Paul had obviously already spoken to them about this when he was there. They was like, you guys can't do this. And they're like, yeah, you know what, Paul, we think you're being a bit old-fashioned, a bit of a fuddy-duddy, whatever it might be. This is far more important than your particular Jewish moral standards, because, no Jewish man is going to be going to one of these festivals, one of these feasts. It's certainly going to be the Greeks or the Romans that are doing that. They're just looking at it going, look, okay, that's your kind of Jewish heritage. That's not really how we roll in the Greek world, so we're going to continue to do that. So they're using that as an excuse, and they go into these festivities. And so that's one of the problems that is going on, and Paul responds to that in Corinthians 6. But then there's another group that's in the church that are maybe in response to this immorality, but maybe in their own extreme response to the Christian faith, saying in order to be more spiritual, we need to stop having sex. Now, this is a very common idea amongst certain sort of philosophical groups that would say anything of the body defiles the soul. So we need to forfeit anything to do with the body in order to purify the soul. So that's later on in the Christian church, this becomes the idea of Gnosticism. that the body is this disgusting thing that we need to discard. It's all about the spirit. And so we need to get rid of anything that feeds or that nourishes the body. We need to put an end to all of that. So we need to be ascetic. We need to never have sex. We need to not eat certain foods. We have to really treat the body poorly in order to enhance the spirit. So there's early signs of that probably going on in Corinth. This idea that's saying, well, now that we're Christians, now that we've got the Spirit, we need to become more spiritual. And the way that we do that is to never eat certain foods and certainly never have sex again, because all that does is defile the body. So maybe in response to these other guys who are going extreme with the sexuality or just being normal with sexuality, or on the other hand, extreme asceticism and saying we're never going to have sex again, Paul responds to that in Corinthians 7:1, and he's saying, look, it's actually better that you do have sex because of all the sexual immorality. So what Paul tries to draw together is this middle line between the two extremes. On the one hand, it's like, it doesn't matter what I do with the body, so if I have sex with a prostitute, it's of no consequence. On the other hand, everything matters what I do with the body, so we can never have sex again. Paul's like, look, if I was to go one way or the other, I'm probably going to go with the guys that never having sex again. But neither of them are good. Neither of them are a good response, and neither of them are actually a way that you can live properly as a Christian. It's certainly not going to produce the best outcomes. So how about this? How about we constrain sexuality to the marriage? That's going to be the simple middle road solution, very typical Jewish solution to the problem. To say just keep it all in the marriage bed. It's as simple as that. And so it's a middle way forward that Paul is addressing there. And so it's into this context that we come across our verse of this woman who is seeking a divorce. She wants to be separated from her husband. Now, how do we know that it's a woman wanting to divorce her husband? Well, let's read the passage again. We'll sort of break it down a little bit and we'll see sort of what specifically is taking place here. So first of all, he says again in verse 10, he says, to the married, I give this command, not I, but the Lord. Now that's a counterbalance to other verses where he said, this is not a Lord's command, this is my advice. And so he's like, don't just take this as my advice. This actually has precedent in something that Jesus said. And so he gives some authority to what it is that I'm going to say. And what Paul refers back to is a passage in Matthew where Jesus is answering some Pharisees about this very issue. These Pharisees are saying to Jesus, hey, we want to get divorced for any and every reason. And Jesus is saying, well, that's a problem, right there. That's one of the problems that Moses came to deal with, which is why he gave you the ability to divorce, but to give the wife a certificate of freedom that she's now been divorced. But actually, that's not how it was intended to be. So this is the verses in Matthew 19:3. It says, some Pharisees came to test him. They said, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Jesus' response was, I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. So there was a particular school of the Pharisees who were trying to make this case that you could divorce your wife for any and every reason. Again, he could divorce her. So he wanted to leave his wife for any and every reason. And this is what the case that they were making. Can we do that? And in doing that, as Jesus is sort of alluding to, is you're going to leave your wife abandoned. This woman to whom you've made a commitment, you're just going to leave her in the lurch because you just want to go and marry somebody else, or you want to go off and whatever it is that you want to do. Can't do that. And so Moses didn't want divorce to happen at all, but he gave this clause, which was simply that except for marital unfaithfulness, you have to remain faithful to your wife. So the point is that Paul's drawing back to that. He's coming back to a Jewish precedent which says that there is a get out of the marriage free clause, which is that on the grounds of marital unfaithfulness, but otherwise there is really no other good reason for a marriage to be ended. There's no other good reason for a divorce. And so what Paul is sort of drawing on is that idea. And if you are applying this passage pastorally and you're saying, hey, a wife can never leave a husband except for marital unfaithfulness, and so a husband might be quite literally beating his wife, physically abusing her, and the pastor will say, yeah, but is he cheating on you? Is he cheating on you with another woman? Well, if he's not, then you need to go back to him, because that's the only grounds on which you could. So wherever there's nuance, it still gets it wrong. It still makes a completely immoral case that she has to go back to him. But the point that Paul's doing here is to simply draw on that and to say, okay, now when we get to this issue in Corinth, let's reevaluate it in those terms, that there is grounds for divorce, certain grounds, very strict grounds. Does that measure up to what is actually going on in this situation that we're faced here with this situation in Corinth? So he says to her then, says to the church, a wife must not separate from a husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to a husband, and a husband must not divorce his wife. So the fact that he says a wife must not separate from a husband and then gives all of this additional information, if she does, she must remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband, tells us clearly that there is a particular woman in Corinth who's seeking a divorce. In fact, by the time Paul got the letter, the divorce might have already taken place. It sounds like it was already on the way out. And it was almost like, oh, by the way, Paul, I'm leaving my husband. Well, how do we know that there's a specific situation going on? It's the fact that Paul actually addressed it directly to a woman. He talks about a woman, a single woman. And if he was talking about general advice, if he was trying to say divorce is never allowed, it's never to be initiated, it can never happen, he would address the men. Because the reality is that almost all divorce is going to be initiated by the men. Yes, women could do it, but legally, but they were never in a financial position to do that. It was only ever going to be the man who would leave her. She would just never do that. And so the fact that he addresses a particular woman tells us pretty clearly that this is a specific person who actually wants it. So Paul is dealing with one particular woman who wants to be divorced for some reason, and Paul's saying, no, your reason is not good enough. Unless you can separate from him, but you have to be reconciled back to him because there's no good enough ground for you to leave him in the first place. That being, if we take in the words of Jesus, unfaithfulness, but there's not serious enough grounds for this. And by the way, husbands can't leave their wives. Let's balance it both ways, but let's deal with this particular situation, which is that you, lady, whoever you are, you want to leave your husband. Well, you can't. You need to be either separated from him, but then reconciled, but that's the only way that this can move forward. So that raises then the question, why is she wanting to leave him in the first place? Well, the most logical guess would be, based on what Paul has previously said and just the overall context of the letter, is that she's married to a non-Christian. She's a Christian woman who's become a Christian apart from her husband, and she's married to a non-Christian. And that did happen. We've got cases where married women are Christians, and they're coming apart from their husband, which isn't a story in and of itself, but that certainly did happen. And so this particular woman is married to a non-Christian. She's now become a Christian, and she wants to leave her non-Christian husband. It's as simple as that. Now, what could be driving this? Well, maybe it's that she's buying into this idea of not having sex again, of sexual asceticism, perhaps. And that's certainly not going to fly back at home. Her non-Christian husband, if she's coming home to him and saying, oh, I'm sorry, we're never going to have sex again, is like, I don't think so. And so for her, in order to fulfill that pledge that she's making to herself, it would be easier just to leave her husband. Or more likely, she just doesn't want to be married to a non-Christian because perhaps in her mind, having sex with a non-Christian is going to defile her. And look, we will go, of course, that's a silly idea. These are brand new Christians. As of like 5 minutes ago, Christianity has hit the scene. They don't know any of this stuff. They don't have a framework for any of this. And so in her mind, the idea of having sex with a non-Christian is possibly the idea that is going to defile her. And so she would rather pull back from that and not engage with him, which again is going to cause problems at home. It's not just going to cause problems for her, it's going to cause problems for the church, because he's going to get around and saying, hey, that church down the road is saying that women can never have sex with their husbands. So that's going to create a problem. Or even more simply, she just wants a Christian husband. She just wants to marry somebody who is actually a Christian. Now, that would be a legitimate claim. That would be a reasonable desire. Doesn't justify it. But you just go, okay, if you can choose between married to a non-Christian and as Christian, you're going to choose the Christian. You can understand where she would be coming from if that's the reason for it. But in Paul's mind, it's like, no, I'm sorry, that's not good enough. That's not a clear enough reason for you to leave your husband. There's actually a bigger picture at work here, which is, well, firstly, his salvation, but even more broadly, there's the reality that Jesus is still coming back tomorrow. Now, here's where our 21st century liberal-mindedness would come in and say, well, hang on, what about her rights? What about her freedoms? What about the fact that she should be able to be married to a Christian, and she should be able to leave her non-Christian husband to marry this other Christian and have a happy life? What about her happiness? True. But if Jesus is coming back tomorrow, that's not really the priority. Because if we're going to play that game, well, I think the priority should be to the slaves. What about the happiness of the slaves of, not being slaves? Like, why don't we start to fight that battle? Like, we can fight all those battles, in this life, and waste a lot of time doing it for no actual outcome, and waste a lot of time because Jesus is coming back tomorrow. So we've got to pick our battles. If Jesus is coming back in 24 hours, we can focus our efforts on getting more people saved, or we can focus our efforts on fighting a losing battle for the freedom of slaves or for the rights of women. But that's not a battle that we can ever hope to win. And so why don't we pick our battles smartly and pick the ones that we can actually have a chance with, which is preaching the gospel, getting the message out there, because Jesus might come back in 24 hours. So that's what's driving Paul. Like, there are 100 battles we could be fighting here. Let's pick the one that has the greatest success, that has the greatest potential for success, and the one that can bear the most fruit, and the one that's not going to get us put up on crosses either. Like, there's always that factor as well. So, lady, whoever you are, please just hang in there, because there's actually a bigger picture at work here. And notice doesn't say anything about the state of her happiness. Like, she might be very happily married. He might be a good husband that provides for her, and all is otherwise well. She just wants to be married to somebody different. And Paul's like, look, I get that there's this issue. Like, you want to be married to someone else. Like, I'm not dismissing that, but it's still actually not a good enough reason for you just to up and leave. Now, remembering that she could just easily up and leave, and it's not a formal process. And she may have already left him by this stage, because it really was simply a matter of just get up, walk out the door, and the marriage is over. So Paul's like, look, I get it, but again, there is this bigger picture at work here, which is, what about the opportunity you have, which is to potentially bring him into the kingdom? That has to weigh into this decision as well. That, okay, you may not have the perfect marriage because he's not a Christian, but at the same time, you've actually got a situation where you can bring about Jesus into that particular circumstance. And so where we get that idea from is just in the very next verse. Verse 12 says, to the rest I say, this I, not the Lord. This is Paul giving advice now. He's sort of flipping it back from, that was the Lord's command. Now it's just good pastoral advice. If any brother has a wife who is a believer, and she is willing to live, not a believer, and she's willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer, and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. And so Paul says, look, if you can hang in there, there's something else, there's a bigger picture at work here, which is that you've got this opportunity to sanctify him. And it's not that he's saved because he's with you. That's not what Paul means. What it means is that he's in a place where he's with a Christian. There's somebody who is bringing a Christian influence into his life, bringing the light into his life. That's a good thing. And if you can keep that, then that should be a priority. That the kingdom, the spreading of the gospel is actually the biggest priority, should be the driving priority, especially if Jesus is coming back tomorrow. So if you can hang in there, do that with that more kingdom approach in mind. And at the same time too, he goes on and he says, otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. So the thing that she would need to keep in mind as well, that if she does leave, the kids stay with him. She has no legal right over the children. So she has to leave the children behind. And, well, they're going to be worshipping the gods of the household, which are his gods, and all of the consequences that go along with that. If you can just stay in there, the kids have an opportunity, he has an opportunity. That at least has to be something of a priority in your decision-making here. And not just flippantly, oh, I'm just not happy. I just want to have this other type of marriage, and so I'm going to go off and get that instead. So Paul's like, look, just keep that bigger picture in mind, is all I'm saying to you here. But he says, as a proviso, if the unbeliever leaves, let it be so. The brother or sister is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to live in peace. How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? So you don't know how this is going to turn out. And it could be that you save your husband, your wife, becomes a Christian as a result of you staying there. That's a great outcome. And you actually get the thing that you were wanting in the first place, which was a Christian husband. And the kids stay with you and everything holds together and it's a wonderful outcome. And you actually ultimately get the thing that you were desiring in the first place rather than trying to maybe take a shortcut to whatever this thing is. But please, whatever decision you make, let it be determined by the greater good of the kingdom. So what do we do with this? What is actually going on in this passage? Well, very clearly, it's not a black and white command that all times and all places a wife can never leave her husband and a husband can never divorce his wife. It's not doing that. That is the furthest thing from Paul's mind as some universal command for all times and all places. Paul has a very, very specific picture in mind of what is it's a very particular situation going on that he's specifically addressing here. And what he wants this wife and everyone by extension in the church, but particularly this wife to do is to think about or to make decisions based on this bigger picture of the kingdom. Yes, you have your own priorities, but there's also a larger priority that you've signed up to in being a Christian. That has to at least inform your decisions here. And that really almost has to take precedence over maybe some of your own personal needs. If the kingdom is more important, or if the kingdom sort of trumps those particular needs, well, then that's just the way it has to be. If, on the other hand, he is being unfaithful, then by all means, you have biblical precedent to leave. Like Paul is drawing on a command of Jesus that says, except for marital unfaithfulness, that is grounds for divorce. Apart from that, then you need to stay with it because there are no really good grounds in that case to stay with the marriage. And so certainly that is there, but only to say that this particular verse is specifically dealing with one particular person, and it is not a universal instruction for all times and all places. Now, there's plenty more that can be said about marriage and divorce and cultural issues and all of the legal issues and all of that. Like I say, I don't have the skills to go into all of that, only to say that if we're going to take this particular verse and use it as some black and white hammer to beat especially wives with and say, no, you can never leave, and Christians, you can never get divorced because of this clear black and white. No, you're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong. You're reading it wrong, and you are applying it to every situation, and you're not bringing any context or any nuance to it, and you're actually potentially creating more harm, creating harm, in fact, actually by the way that this is being done. So only to say, we just need to read all of this with a little bit of context and bring some of that nuance to our application of these texts. And this one in particular needs quite a bit of nuance. Now, I'm very aware of the fact that everything I've just been saying is probably going to raise more questions than it's answered. But hopefully it's at least causing us to ask questions that are going to make us think about, well, if that's true for that passage, it might be true for other passages as well, that we might just be very simplistically reading, but in doing so are actually causing more harm than good in the way that we handle them. So at the very least, hopefully it's going to bring about that as a consequence, and certainly not to give any pastoral advice or to speak to any situations at all, only to say that in this particular passage, this is what's going on at that particular time and in that particular place. And so therefore, take all of that, incorporate it into all of the other thinking and all of the other processing that's going on, and then do with it as you will. But I'm going to have to leave that up to you. Anyway, hopefully that's been helpful. We'll be back here again next week with another one of these controversial or out of context verses. But until then, have a great week, and I'll see you then. All the best.